Hello Chain Gang, welcome back to the 4 Chains and Top 5 Friday. Today's list is the 5 most influential world leaders of all time. So hopefully that this will be a good one. But full disclosure, it's Top 5 Friday, so we are on a deadline and I have been feeling under the weather. So my voice has been sounding terrible and we put it off, but today is the last possible day. So I am going to be doing this medicated. Normally Angie goes through the video afterwards and corrects whatever mistakes I make because I have an outline in front of me, but I don't have the actual statistics. But today she is off camera. If you want to say hello, sweetie.
Hello, sweetie.
Nope. Oh, jeez. That's a comedy callback from a previous video. But, you know, she's going to try to correct me kind of full time. So I'm going to go ahead and double up. This might be a mistake, but I just don't want to sound terrible audio-wise. Oh, that is really bad. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to put up a list here. It might already be up on the screen. I don't know when she puts it up there. These are the lists of stuff that we came up originally with. If there's a top 5 list on here that you want to see sooner rather than later, just put it in the comments. We give you a shout out if we choose the one that you chose. More importantly, if you have an idea for a top 5 list that is not on here, then let us know that, and obviously you get a shout out for that. Let me say what today's list is not. It's influential world leaders. Think of it as like world political leaders or heads of state. So before people protest, I want to say who's not on this list. Like obviously communism and particularly in recent modern history has been a big deal, and you might feel that Karl Marx is the leader who's most influential in terms of communism, but he doesn't qualify because he was never a head of state. He never ran a political government, so maybe Chairman Mao would be eligible, but not Karl Marx. Freedom of religion is important, but Thomas Jefferson would be eligible, where John Locke and Martin Luther would not. If you saw our last video on presidents, you know, people like Confucius and Jesus of Nazareth, they're more important than most of the people on this list, but they were never actually head of state, so they don't qualify. So those people won't be on the list. And then the other people won't be on the list is people that do qualify as being heads of state, but our information that we know to be fact about them is, you know, unreliable at best. I would say that you know, like Menes was the most powerful man in the world 5,000 years ago, but we just know very little about him and what he actually did. So people like him will not qualify. I think the line is probably like Cyrus the Great. Now, Cyrus the Great is obviously influential. He is a real person that walked the earth. He founded the Persian Empire, but when you read his biography and the stories about him, at least half of them are just BS. So it's kind of, they have to have more information than Cyrus the Great to qualify. You know, King David obviously is a massively important person, but just once again, some of those stories, I mean, you know, David killed Andre the Giant with like a slingshot.
Nope, not Andre the Giant, Goliath. David killed Goliath.
Goliath. Okay, so this wasn't a Princess Bride situation.
Nope, not a Princess Bride reference, nope.
Okay, maybe you should not have 2 of these, but anyways, you understand what I'm saying. Like, it's just apocryphal, so I'm not sure. So let's dive into the top 5 list. This was the toughest decision because there was like 3 hugely famous world leaders who were these massive conquerors and conquered vast amount of territories and whose names will live forever. But in all 3 cases, the territory they conquered shrank back down considerably. So in all 3 cases, they're influential people, but mostly influential during the time at which they lived, and their influence has shrank over the course of history. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what my thinking was. I consider Genghis Khan, I love that show about the Khans, Marco Polo. Genghis Khan's territory lasted longer than the other 2 people I consider, but I just felt like Genghis Khan was the least influential because, I mean, like, I just don't know how different today's world would be if the Mongols had never ruled the world. I mean, I just don't know any Mongolians. I remember when I was a kid, I thought I knew a Mongolian, Killer Khan. He was a wrestler, a Mongolian giant, but then I found out like he was actually from Japan. So that to me kind of eliminated him. The second person I considered, very similar resume, Alexander the Great. His territory lasted less than the territory of the Khans, but I felt like he was more influential because he conquered Eastern and Western nations, but he embraced the culture, unlike the Mongols, and he merged the Eastern and Western cultures, and that merge has maintained today, like that. So his legacy was further lasting on that. The tiebreaker with him is I kind of feel like Aristotle was, his teacher. His father was Philip of Macedonian, and he was kind of born on third base. I mean, the armies that he conquered with were already very well trained. They already had the best equipment. Aristotle, maybe the smartest guy who ever lived, was his teacher. And so I feel like, although maybe I put him 6th most influential world leader, he doesn't quite crack the top 5. Number 5, number 5 is Napoleon Dynamite.
Nope, it's Bonaparte, not Napoleon Dynamite.
Okay. My friend Diedrich Baders was in Napoleon Dynamite. I guess let me give a plug. Anybody check out Diedrich Bader? He was Carl Bader when he went to T.C. Williams. He plays Rex in Napoleon Dynamite. It's like a martial arts teacher, so go check that out. But I feel like maybe that counts. Actually, this was like an embedded mistake. It was a purposeful mistake because Napoleon Bonaparte, obviously Napoleon Dynamite is named after him, so he influenced that movie. He's a huge influence on, just go with that.
Okay.
So here's the thing about Napoleon. Obviously, he gets so much credit for being maybe the best general of all time because he won so many battles where he was completely overmatched. I mean, he marched his army all the way to Moscow. And keep in mind, in retrospect, it's even more important, he did that with a bunch of French guys. Like, he got a bunch of people from France and marched successfully all the way to Moscow. Like, that is unbelievable. But, in the end, when Napoleon was done, his territory was basically the same as when he started. Basically what happened, I mean, I wasn't there, obviously. I'm old, I'm not that old. But the way I figure it is like, he conquered all these places in Europe, and then when they deposed Napoleon, they were like, hey, wait a minute, do you have any more tough French guys? By the way, Napoleon was Corsican. That might be the reason why he's the toughest French guy who ever lived. They were like, hey, are there any more tough French guys over there? And I'm sure the French were like really rude and snippety when you asked them for another cup of coffee or something like that. But basically they had to admit, that was kind of it. And they were like, well, then give me our land back. And of course the French did give it back. So it's weird that I would rank him number 5 because he's known as this great general and this great conqueror, and that's not what gives him the nod. There are 3 things that give him the nod. I guess 4 if you count Napoleon Dynamite. The 3 things, I guess the most important is the Napoleonic Code. One of the things that made feudalism is the least successful type of extractive economy. If you read Why Nations Fail, you can certainly understand why, but he got rid of that in a lot of places and replaced it with the Napoleonic Code. And even when they took their territory back, they were like, this does kind of work better. It worked better in a lot of reasons. Number one, it laid out a consistent set of laws, and you need rule of law. That's another Why Nations Fail reference. You need the rule of law to be able to have a cohesive, well-functioning country and economy. But it also was merit-based. People were like, hey, I don't like Napoleon, but that whole deal of like, having people do the jobs who most deserve it as opposed to just this one family who did nothing but inbreeding leading it, I'm not so sure that we want to go back to that. So they kept the Napoleonic Code. Certainly in France, it's literally the law of the land today. There have been modernizations to it, but that's mostly deal to modern sensibilities. The bones of the Napoleonic Code are still in effect today and still very influential. Another reason why he's influential is the Louisiana Purchase. Now you may say to yourself, well, that was stupid. Why did he sell all that territory to the United States for less than 4 cents an acre? And you're making a good point, but keep in mind, I'm only counting influence here. Whether you did something bad or did something good isn't relevant to how influential it is. Whether you did something smart or something dumb, if it turned out to be influential, that counts. And he wanted to get his troops back. He didn't want to spend any money over there. He wanted some extra money from the United States, $15 million to be exact. And so he did that, and that transformed the United States and made the chances of their success much more likely. So obviously that had a huge effect on the history of the world. But then also, his defeat. He was so successful in battle that when he finally lost at Waterloo, it was a huge news story. And everybody just couldn't believe it. And it's gained so much fame that this group, ABBA, wrote this song about it, Waterloo, and it wound up winning the European Song Contest. And then ABBA wound up selling 400 million albums. So these people that count Waterloo against Napoleon, I think in the end it was just a big win, right, sweetie?
That's right.
Remember we got kicked out of that Italian museum?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, for singing that at this famous Waterloo painting. You can go check that out in the archives. So that's why I have Napoleon at number 5. Let's go to number 4. Number 4, if I was making a list of people who had the worst PR agent of all time, this guy would be in it. His name is, depending on who you talk to, Emperor Yang, or Qin Shi Huang Ti, or Xin Huang Di. What he is the person who, he's known as the person who unified China, but in reality, he absolutely created China. I think people think that at one point China was led by the Han dynasty, and then the Zhou dynasty, and the Qin, and the Qi, and no, none of those. Those were dynasties that led one single province inside what we now know to be China. China was created by Qin because he was the leader of the Qin dynasty, and his accomplishment in unifying it is just startling, because when you think about what he did, in all likelihood, it may never have happened if he had not lived. And those are the kind of big difference makers when you're talking about this level of influence. And so the question is, because of the fact that he did that, China today is the second largest economy in the world. Why isn't he more well known? I gather most of the people watching this had no clue who I was talking about. He built the Great Wall of China. Everybody knows the Great Wall of China. Nobody knows who built it. He has the coolest tomb/mausoleum of anybody ever born. If you look at the terracotta warriors, I'll put a little shot up here of it. That whole tomb, we don't even know how big it is because they're still uncovering it, but we know it's over a mile. He essentially built a mini China so he could live forever. It's got 6,000 warrior army to protect him. It has entertainers, it has fish, it has livestock, it has rivers, it has everything that he would need. You would think that this would be one of the most famous people ever. Why isn't he? I want to talk about that for a little. Number 1, his name. He's not, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, even George Washington. It's just, every time I listen to an audiobook, and I've listened to many on Asian history, everybody pronounces his names incorrectly. I'm going to call him Huang Di just to make it easy for me, but just the fact that I want to do that should tell you something. And so I think that's part of the marketing problem. The second problem is China doesn't want to market him. China doesn't want him to be the face of Chinese history the way the United States wants George Washington to be the face of our history, because, number 1, he wasn't a good dude. He was very cruel. He killed relatives, children, wives, siblings, whoever he had to do to take out the competition. He was very cruel about doing it. He was also kind of a weirdo. China wants people to be sophisticated, and this guy was he believed he could be immortal. He would drink mercury because he thought that was going to make him immortal. It turned out to kill him, but he believed it so much that he arranged for his mummified corpse to be soaked in mercury, and there's all kinds of mercury samples from the land there. He had all kinds of weird beliefs, so he's a weirdo. He's very cruel, and then the number 1 thing is he had all of Confucius's books burned. He didn't want anybody having any ideas that were other than the ideas he was forwarding. And so he burned Confucius's book. Basically every book he burned, other than the ones he needed, like on agriculture and stuff. And China wants Confucius to be the George Washington of China. And eventually, of course, Confucius came more into standing, and that's why Confucius is so much more famous than he is. But let's talk about why he should be more famous. First of all, why it was so hard to conquer all of the Chinese provinces. A lot of it was geographical. There's all kinds of jungles and, rivers and just the topography of it was very difficult, and the provinces were not connected through any transportation hub. So just one person getting from one province to the other is difficult. Never mind getting a whole army to go through that. So that was really an impressive thing. And then once he did the same thing that Napoleon did. He overturned feudalism, and he made it more of a merit-based system. You're seeing how this works. But what made it impressive was he standardized everything. Because no matter what province you were in, if you were in one province, you spoke a completely different kind of language, you had different coinage, you had everything. He made all of that uniform. Weights and measures. The laws were the same in every province after he conquered. Even like the axle size of wheels was the same. And then he connected all of the provinces with roads and with canals, which not only gave a sense of unity, but also it, you could travel more freely in between the provinces. So, given that China has lasted so much longer than the United States or even Rome, why would I not put him higher is the only question. And the real reason for that is Tsai Lun. Part of the reason for China existing for so long is Tsai Lun. Tsai Lun invented paper. Now, we take paper for granted today, but that is what turned China into a gigantic power. The best way to think of it is, imagine if only one nation today had computers and the internet. That sounds like an exaggeration, but it absolutely isn't. Think about back then. Papyrus and wood is what people wrote on. When China had paper and nobody else did, what somebody in China could carry in a backpack from Oshkosh Bagosh would take like 2 animals pulling a wagon in some other place. And it just made China so much more efficient than everybody in every single way. And all of a sudden, they went from being like backwards to more advanced than the West. And it showed. The compass was invented, gunpowder was invented, printing was invented. There's no reason to invent printing when you're writing on papyrus and wood. And you may think to yourself, well, why didn't, it doesn't seem like that impressive an invention. Well, clearly it was, because for centuries, China's the only people that had paper. It wasn't until like the year 750, I think, Germany finally kidnapped a paper maker. Now, you say to yourself, well, why was it that hard? Tsai Lun was treated like an emperor. Him and the other people that made paper got to live in the palace. Now, granted, they were essentially prisoners, but they lived the life of luxury because China realized how important it was to keep this invention away. When one was finally kidnapped and then paper got to the West, things started turning around and then completely flipped over, and the West became a more advanced society when Gutenberg invented the printing press. Let me just say real quick. I'm saying it that way to simplify it because that's what people think of Gutenberg. Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press, but he invented movable type. And movable type made the printing press so much more of a practical, influential invention, but that's what turned it around. The other reason why maybe he's not higher than number 3 is China, although they've made a lot of adjustments to keep going, they still have elements of extraction in their economy. And you can already see that their economy is starting to go down in the last decade. And history proves that that downslide will be likely to continue. So maybe 100 years from now, this video he'll look like maybe he shouldn't even be 3. Speaking of 3, let's move on to 3. 3 is going to be, a real short one Because it's George Washington. And the reason why is because we went into detail in ranking the top 5 US presidents in terms of influence with George Washington. So I won't rehash all of it here, but it has to do with 2 factors. Okay, obviously the United States has been an important nation, particularly in modern history, but it's freedom. George Washington basically invented freedom. Now there's a lot of, like I talked about in the other video, let's fight for our freedom! And it's these inspiring movies, but in actuality, they weren't fighting for freedom as we know it today. They were fighting to be independent from what other country was ruling them at the time. They weren't fighting for freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to elect the people that govern them, none of those things. There's lots of countries that have that type of freedom today, and they have that because the experiment of the United States of America worked, and the only reason it worked is because of George Washington. So that's the number 1 reason. And then the number 2 reason I would say is that he left office voluntarily. Now I know Cincinnatus left office voluntarily and power voluntarily, but that was more a thing where he was tired and he just wanted to go home. It was less consequential than when George Washington did it. We take it for granted all around the world today, but it was startling when a healthy George Washington, who obviously could have ruled the United States for the remainder of his life, voluntarily stepped down. That is a monumental impact on how the world is today. And that puts him in the number 3 slot alone. Let's talk about number 2. Number 2 is Augustus Caesar. Now, I think because there were so many names back in ancient Rome that when I say Augustus Caesar, you might think I'm talking about Julius Caesar. I am not. Augustus Caesar is sort of like the Thomas Jefferson is in modern days. Like, Augustus Caesar was the most important Roman emperor, the most influential Roman emperor, but somebody wrote a play about somebody else, and that person became much more famous. In Jefferson's case, it's Alexander Hamilton. I'm surprised, even though he was never present, that people don't think Alexander Hamilton should be ranked above Thomas Jefferson in that list. It's amazing how that's turned around, but, good plays are effective, and William Shakespeare, or Edward de Vere, the person who actually wrote Shakespeare's plays, he wrote sorry about that. No, Antony and Cleopatra, is that what you're about to say?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. He wrote Antony and Cleopatra and of course Julius Caesar. And in neither of those plays does Augustus Caesar come off well. And that's a problem. And then Julius Caesar, of course, comes off as this unbelievably heroic, charismatic guy, which he was. But the other thing is that Julius Caesar wrote his own history. Julius Caesar was a brilliant author. And so he wrote his biography. He wrote enticing books that still exist today about his battles, and he created his own myth. So most people think Julius Caesar is the more important of the two. He is not. His importance is based on the fact that he conquered Gaul, which essentially modern day France, and that he named Augustus Caesar his heir and his son right before he died, meaning Augustus Caesar had the wealth to do what he did, create the Roman Empire, position himself to defeat Antony and Cleopatra. So I would say that Julius Caesar is the more famous, but not the more important. So I guess I have to say who Augustus Caesar is, other than Julius Caesar's adopted son. He's the first emperor of Rome. He ruled for 40 years, which is astonishing in a time when life expectancy was under 40 years. And it created the Pax Romana, which is 200 years of peace. And so I think that that was important because that essentially created Western culture. He was able to sponsor the arts. Homer, Ovid, Livy, the Augustan age. I would say that we live in the Augustan age and the Newtonian age right now. I would say of the two people who, almost everybody who watches this video right now, your day-to-day life has had more influence by Augustus Caesar and Isaac Newton than any two people. You don't have a single day of your life in all likelihood that isn't different because those men reign. And the reason is obviously Newton because of his scientific achievements, but we're talking about Augustus because he created a system of government that we take for granted now, but that every government on planet Earth now operates by because it works so much better. The things that seem obvious today were not obvious back then. Let's reel them off real quick. The one he's most famous for is standing armies. You know, back then, the Pax Romana, why it was so remarkable to have 200 years of peace, you know, Rome conquered people outside, but I mean within the city of Rome, is because the way wars were fought is rich people would hire an army or at the very least promise them wealth if they sided with them and then won the battle. And you're basically gambling on, there was a lot of unemployment back then, on siding with the winner. Augustus Caesar had untold wealth that allowed him to pay an army through the government, even though it was his funds, to exist all the time. So he didn't have people couldn't get to the point where they were raising an army because Augustus Caesar was already paying all of them. How was one single human being able to do this? Well, when he won the Battle of Actium, he was the second richest person on the planet. The richest was Cleopatra because Egypt, she was essentially her province, and she had all of the wealth involving minerals and grain that Egypt had. And of course, Rome would pay Egypt for that grain to feed their citizens. When he conquered that, he personally owned the wealth of the two most wealthy nations that there had ever been. I looked up his wealth. Honey, could you look up the Augustus Caesar wealth? I'll come to you in a second, but I remember looking at it and it was like, you take Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, you take the 10 wealthiest people in the world today and you combine their wealth, and it wasn't half of what Augustus Caesar's wealth would be in that time. He had he was not only the richest person in the world, but the richest person that there'd ever been and ever would be, and he used his personal wealth to create an empire. What's the stats on Augustus's wealth?
So if you add up the 10 richest people on Earth now, today, they're worth $1.2 trillion. Augustus Caesar's net worth in today's dollars would be 5.8 trillion, which is almost 5 times the amount of the 10 richest people in the world combined.
Okay, so yeah, nobody's ever going to get that wealthy. Hopefully, yikes, that would be scary. But you know, there's so many things we take for granted. For instance, like people were getting sick because there was no sanitation. He created, the system of aqueducts to get fresh water. He created I don't want to say the plumbing system. I don't know the right words because I'm fully medicated now. But so it could be a much more sanitary system. A lot of people talk about the fact that he created this standing army that kept the peace, but he basically did a lot of other things that we take for granted. One of them that nobody talks about that I think is a big deal is the fire department. You take for granted the fact that maybe you can even hear there's sirens in the background right now, that you can call 911 if your house is burning, your business is burning, and get the fire department. That's not how it worked back then. Back then it was privatized. And although they did respond suspiciously quickly, it was a situation where you had to pay them first and then they would put out the fire. So like, let's say an apartment complex is burning. Which apartment residents in Rome, probably 80% of the people in there are unemployed, is going to pay the fire department to put out the fire? And while that's happening, a lot of burning is going on. And so Augustus made the fire department part of the government, just like he made trash collection and the baths and the sewage systems and everything. So I think that plus the culture, it was the most powerful empire ever. I think that as a general rule, the fact that Augustus Caesar, who created the most influential empire that there ever was, is entitled to be number 2 on this list. The only question is, why is he only number 2 on this list? And I believe that the reason is because number 1 on this list is Muhammad. Now, what makes Muhammad unique is that he was a powerful political leader and a powerful religious leader, and he ranks at the near the top in both of those categories. Let's start with the fact that he founded Islam. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world, and the Muslim religion is the religion that in my lifetime has had the most converts. So obviously he deserves to be considered close to number one just for that. But that's not just what he did. He was also a political leader. He created the Arab Empire, which at the time became the largest empire in the history of the world. And unlike Alexander and Genghis Khan and Napoleon, the Arab Empire continued to grow after Muhammad passed on. And a lot of the reasons was the Muslim religion. Now, granted, a lot of that territory has been taken back, but the Muslim religion has remained in much of that territory. Obviously, that's why there's 2 billion. The other thing is that his impact on the Muslim religion itself is huge. That seems obvious, but let me talk about what I mean. Because of the fact that Western culture, as we described in the Augustus Caesar part, has been more influential on world events by a lot than Arab culture, the Bible is a more important document than the Quran. I'm not getting religious or political, I'm just saying just factually. And it's not just because there's more Christians than Muslims, it's more that the Christian culture has had a larger impact on the world. But the difference is the Bible, the kind of Bible that we're looking at today, that was basically formed 400 years after Jesus died by a bunch of Romans who the previous month had believed in, they were polytheists. They had believed in the sun god and the wind god and all of that. I mean, I know there's more versions of the Bible than there are words in the Bible, but the basic premise for the Bible is that. And as a Christian myself, I can tell you that, a lot of the things that were included reflected the sensibilities of Roman politics 400 years after Jesus lived. A lot of those things, if you actually read the Bible, which I have, are things that Jesus clearly did not believe in and clearly would never have said. I think if you're looking for more accurate that, I would read Zealot by Reza Aslan in terms of the real Jesus person that walked the face of the earth. But that also, but the Quran was different. The Quran was taken directly from Muhammad's teaching. Essentially, almost everything that's in the Quran, you can feel pretty secure of things that Muhammad said and believed. But the main thing about Muhammad is none of what he's done would have existed without him. Like 0% chance. You can make the argument that even if George Washington wouldn't have lived, the United States would have survived. I think it's a difficult argument to make, but you can make that. You cannot make that argument with Muhammad. Before Muhammad, Arabs were polytheists, just like the Romans. They believed in multiple gods. It's not like Islam was this movement and Muhammad was an opportunity. He's like, hey man, this is starting to catch on. Maybe I'll be the leader. That's not what Muhammad did. What Muhammad did was he got a vision. And he spread that vision, and he was an influential leader and speaker and a magnetic personality. And he was able to form that religion into one of the world's great religions. And however you feel about it, your religious beliefs. I mean, in terms of its impact on the world. And the Arab Empire, he was the underdog when he first started trying to make his way back to Mecca, and it was far from a foregone conclusion that he was going to be able to do what he did. So I think that the fact that he created one of the world's largest religions and created one of the world's largest empires, and neither of those things ever would have happened without him, means that Muhammad is the most influential world leader that there has ever been. So if you feel differently, it's okay. I have a thick skin. Go ahead and put that in the comments. If there are lists you would like to see other than this, I know like maybe combining all of these influences and just ranking the most influential people or something like that, go ahead and put that in the comments, and we will give you a shout out if we use yours. And I just want to thank everybody for taking the time and tuning in to Top 5 Friday on the 4 Chains.